Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session of the European Strategic Dialogue, which brings together the Institute Cassis at the University of Bonn, the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung, the Institut Français aux Pays-Bas in The Hague, and Leiden University in the neighborhood of The Hague, and actually with two campuses, one in Leiden and one in The Hague, actually. This is about, the terrible news we are all receiving from the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We are confronted with these mind-boggling news since weeks. It seems a little bit that this war is a war at stalemate by now. But this war has changed a lot of so-called truisms, also in my country, I have to say. We are all supporting the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russian invasion, and we will continue to do so. And at the end of this week, we will have summit meetings of NATO and the European Union, and the European Union will also talk to President Biden, who will then continue to Warsaw. And that is quite interesting to see how Western unity, both in NATO and in the European Union, has become the main feature of our response. We're all hoping that these negotiations, which are going on as we speak, will find room for a peaceful settlement, but there are doubts whether that is possible. And at the same time, we are all of us facing quite a lot of moral and political dilemmas. For example, there were demands for a NATO involvement, like a no-fly zone or providing fighter aircraft. And whilst we feel a lot of moral impulses to do so and come to support, we feel at the same time that the political consequences of that, the fallout, as you might say, is unbearable because we are dealing with a nuclear power which has threatened us with unspeakable consequences. So basically, people are talking about the risk of a third world war if we would go down that road. We can't do that. The topical debate of the last 1 or 2 weeks was the energy supply we are receiving from Russia. It's a debate on moral, political, and economic terms at the same time. And for example, here in my country, in Germany, we are trying very hard to get away from our needs for Russian energy to come to Germany, support our industry, etc. But that is long term. You have seen news about Germany reaching out to Norway and Qatar, and that is a long-term solution. So the question for many people right now is, if that is long-term, what can we do short-term? And if it's not possible to have a full stop, is it possible to reduce, or is it possible to put some of the revenues in trust funds, etc.? So that is another area of heated debate here in Europe. And last not least, we have all the refugees coming into Europe from Ukraine. And whilst there's a lot of will and enthusiasm to support, there's also need to coordinate, to make sure that these people not just have a nice welcome, but a lasting solution if the stay would be longer, including integration in labor market, schooling, housing, etc. So there are many issues at the headlines front right now, and I'm very glad that we have a chance to discuss this here in the framework of our European Strategic Dialogue. And with this, I'm passing the floor to Sophie Beretier, which will lead us through today's debate. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Dirk. Welcome, everyone, whether you're part of our online panel or our online audience for this third edition of the European Strategic Dialogue. For anyone who joined us a bit late, today we are going to concentrate on Russia's war in Ukraine and particularly its strategic consequence for Europe. Dirk has already mentioned a plethora of consequences which we have seen unfold for Ukraine and the world. I find it important to also remind ourselves that much higher economic impact will be for the world's poorest countries, which are highly dependent on the imports from Ukraine and Russia. And all these estimates about refugees and deaths and civilian casualties don't even take into account the already devastating impact of the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, which have been going on already for many years. So indeed, the war has raised many questions, which have led to a proliferation of talks and seminars on the war in Ukraine. As has been stated by Russia's Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Lavrov himself, this is not about Ukraine at all. This is about the world order. Therefore, one may wonder about the challenges and opportunities which Europe will face in the upcoming years. Will this be the beginning or the end of a strategic Europe in the world? With the strategic reviews of both NATO and the EU around the corner, NATO's strategic concept due in June and the EU strategic compass imminent, this is the time to ask the big questions about the future of Europe. What will be the impact of this war for the international order? What role for the EU, the US, Russia, and China? And what are the prospects of a new European security order? And what could this look like? To provide more clarity on these questions, and hopefully many more from the audience, please let me introduce the fantastic panel of speakers we have today. First, we are honored to have Roderick Parks with us, who is the Research Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations and head of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center, where he works on issues of European integration and the EU's role in the world. Hello, Roderick, welcome. We also have the pleasure to welcome Pierre Haroche, Research Fellow in European Security at the Institute for Strategic Research in Paris. His research focuses on European defense cooperation and the evolution of European institutions. Bonjour, Pierre. Thank you for being with us. I'm also delighted to introduce Nikki Ikani, who is Assistant Professor at Leiden University's Institute of Security and Global Affairs. Her work centers on the intersection of intelligence studies, public policy studies, and EU foreign policy. Welcome, Nikki. And last but not least, we have Yulian Romanishin, Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic, and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. He previously studied political science in Kyiv and received the Global PhD Prize from the Egmont Institute for his work. Hello, Yulian. I will now invite our audience to give a virtual round of applause for our speakers, who will each give a short statement before we open the floor for questions from the public. Please type your questions in the chat if you already have them along the public statements. And if you can, briefly introduce yourself and say who you're asking your question to, if it is directly addressed to someone in particular. You may also bring the discussion on Twitter with the hashtag European Strategic Dialogue. And without much ado, Roderick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. So I will try to be quick and tell me to shut up at any stage. I don't mind. I'm British, but I'm sitting in Berlin, so I'll comment a bit about the impact on the sort of German strategic debate. But I look forward to the questions. I arrived back in Berlin a couple of years ago, and the sort of foreign policy debate here felt very familiar from years of Merkel, and there were probably sort of four characteristics when it came to, frankly, avoiding the bigger problems and choices with global affairs. A tendency to throw money at a problem and think it was going to be solved. A reliance on certain partner countries to take the big decisions, notably France. Failure to draw constructive lessons from history. And I guess also, and above all, a tendency to defer difficult decisions until, frankly, there were no other options left. And the big speech that Olaf Scholz gave, declaring a Zeitenwende seem to mark a change in all of those things. But 10 days down the road, I see all of those traits still there, I'm afraid. And I'll just run through sort of 4 sets of relationships where I think they're still playing out. So if I look at relations inside Germany within the government, I mean, very obviously, it's still the tendency to throw money at the problem, and the announcement of 100 billion euros going on defence, or possibly on something other than defence, without really sensing what sort of strategic decisions are behind that, or indeed even sort of reforming the procurement agency and compliance. I think at the moment there's still a sense that it could go either way, and you may get a big rethink. The Greens rethinking energy, SPD, defence and Russia, Liberals, domestic borrowing and EU fiscal capacity to come up with a sort of big new approach to these issues. And I think relations between Habeck, Lindner and Scholz might allow that, but of course it's a broader debate in Germany, and I think there's been a failure for years to really set out what these decisions would mean. And if that's the case, then money very much goes from being the solution to being the problem, and people are beginning to ask, well, where does this money come from, this 100 billion? And do we really need to spend it on defence, given the shoddy state of the Russian military? This against the background of upcoming regional elections, of which there are still 4 this year. Do we really want to be taking difficult decisions around energy rationing, etc., etc.? So, if you look at the domestic debate, then I think there's tendency to throw money at a problem, but not actually spell out the difficult choices and trade-offs that are facing Germany. Still very much there. Secondly, relations between Germany and its European partners. I mean, you can see that with France again, this heavy reliance on it to take decisions. I was talking to a diplomat here the other day who said her rule was always go into a crisis with a plan and be prepared to tear up that plan. And she said, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, France went in with a plan and isn't prepared to tear it up, and Germany didn't go in with a plan and is, prepared at most to set accents to what France wants. So, it's very much the French agenda when it comes to this sort of mix of Europe, sort of French geostrategy supersized onto an EU level, mixed in with EU with French industrial policy. There is, I think, a bit of a ray of hope there, though. We're looking sort of until after the end of the French presidency to the Czech and the Swedish presidencies, where we think that both of these countries will expect Germany to be in the senior role rather than the junior partner to France. And we've got visits from the Czech Prime Minister coming up in a couple of weeks, really to push the Germans on foreign policy, on European solidarity, on conditionality around rule of law to Poland, Hungary, etc., all the difficult choices. But nevertheless, you can see a sort of abdication to France at the moment of the big political decisions. Thirdly, relations within the neighbourhood. There I'd say, the failures to draw the right lessons from history. When we sort of asked policymakers here about whether they were open to the idea of opening up a sort of membership perspective for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, we got a lot of sort of pseudo-sophisticated answers why that wouldn't be a good idea, sort of pseudo-geopolitics. And quite a lot of them were around the Western Balkans as well, saying, well, we can't sort of disenfranchise them by favouring the Eastern neighbourhood. So we put them in the room with people from the Western Balkans who said, actually, we think that, the best way you can give proof to the Ukrainians that a membership perspective matters is by completing the membership of the Western Balkans and moving ahead on tricky things like, recognition of Kosovo. If not now, then when? And so once we pressed them, what it really came down to was a fear of escalation and a fear of repeating what happened in 2013, 2014, where Germans believed that the offer of an association agreement to Ukraine sort of triggered geopolitics there. Footnote on this, and this comes back to something that you said, Sophie, where there is perhaps a good reason for the EU to tread carefully on sanctions and on enlargement, then with an eye to the southern neighbourhood, which looks at the EU and accuses it at the moment of spreading instability because of its sanctions, and focusing in an unfair way on its eastern flank and not, giving the same to the south. Does that debate appear in Germany at all? As far as I can see, not. It's very Eurocentric. It's very east-west rather than north-south. Finally, relations to China, which you also asked about. Here I think we're in the classic thing of Germany allowing every other option to close down before it makes a difficult choice. So initially there was quite big talk around policymakers here about sort of some big Kissinger-like move where we reach out to China over the heads of the Russians and open a new flank for Russia there. When we said obviously that's unrealistic, and said to people here, you need to make choices. You need to engage the Chinese if you want them, and you need to tell them what it is that you want from a settlement in Ukraine. They were unable to do it. For me, I think it's a sort of clear choice of Germany sitting on its hands until essentially all the big choices are taken for them, and then being forced to sort of engage with China. I'll finish with that. It's easy, of course, for me to sit in a think tank and criticize from the sidelines. And you're very welcome to ask me what the solution is. But last thought, there is no good solution. All solutions are bad, and that's why political leadership is needed at the moment. And I'm afraid that's probably still missing. Anyway, I'm sorry to have been so long. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Very interesting points brought up about the impact of national debates on foreign policy and how this really has as well impact on European strategic autonomy as a whole, especially important given how Ukrainians desperately need that European leadership. That, yes, indeed, there has been a lot of unity on this subject, but I wouldn't say that the unity has been paired with a lot of capacity because we are still in this situation today. It's also a very interesting take on the German lack of leadership. And now we have a perfect follow-up on this with our French counterpart, Pierre, who hopefully will be able to enlighten us on the French position on this issue.
Yeah, hello everybody. I won't talk so much about specifically the French position, but I will talk a little bit about the European Union and its position in this crisis. I think, first of all, a striking fact is that the European Union became an actor in the course of this crisis. At the beginning of January, when I participated to some conference about international relations, the war in Ukraine and so on, the big question was not what will the EU do, is there enough leadership and so on. It was really, does the EU really matter in this whole crisis? Because Russia only intended to talk to the US in this special discussion among great powers. Perhaps Russia also considered some big countries like France and Germany, but not the EU. And it reminded us of what happened in 2021 when Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, went to Moscow and was, as media reported, humiliated because Moscow announced that it would expel European diplomats just when the High Representative was there talking with Lavrov. And at the end of 2021, actually, at the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, Josep Borrell made a statement saying, we don't want decisions to be taken over our heads. So at that, initially, the EU was not even an actor and was certainly not considered as a clear and legitimate actor by Russia. And then I think a first important event was the US decision to exclude completely the military option just 2 weeks before the invasion. Because by taking this very clear position, it immediately gave the first role to economic and financial instruments. And we know that the EU is not necessarily strong as a military actor, but is an important economic actor. And in a way, it also contributes to a broader debate. You remember that in 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen came to power, she said, I want to lead a geopolitical commission. So there was already within European institutions this idea that the EU can be an international actor that matters in international security through its traditional economic policies. And also the COVID crisis illustrated this trend. At the time, it was not necessarily Russia that was the target of EU policies, but China, EU's dependence on China, EU's dependence on critical industrial products or technologies, and so on. And now we have the same debate relaunched again vis-a-vis Russia with energy and so on. So in a way, there is a broader trend behind the evolution of the EU. And yes, sanctions are important. And I think in particular, I'm thinking about the sanction of the Russia Central Bank. EU sanctions were, I think, faster and stronger than people anticipated, and certainly that Russians anticipated, I think. But also the most interesting case is not only economic sanctions, but the decisions to fund arms to Ukraine through the European Peace Facility. And here again, I think we have to put it in perspective because, and here I can talk a little bit from the French point of view, the European Peace Facility, this idea that the EU should be able to send lethal equipment to partners was very much supported, yes, by the External Action Service, but also by France. And it was not consensual at all. And the negotiation was very long, very hard, with many Northern European countries arguing that it was not good for the EU to send lethal equipment. It was not in the EU DNA Pacific as a peaceful power, and that we wouldn't know where this military equipment and perhaps going through corruption regimes or dictatorships and so on. So there was a strong reluctance among EU member states vis-a-vis this lethal equipment. And now, in a few days after the invasion, we had not only the use of these peace facilities. Just to take an example, a few years ago, I remember that the debate was not about lethal equipment, it was about military equipment in general. And I remember French officials telling me that it was impossible for the EU to finance computers for the Central African Army, because since those computers that were actually, the idea was to strengthen the HR capacity of the Central African Army. Since they had a military purpose, it was legally impossible for the EU to provide them. Then there were some instruments trying to link security equipment to development and so on, and then the peace facility and this idea that lethal equipment could be provided. And not only is the peace facility used, but it is used for lethal equipment, which was not the case in the initial phase in December when the EU first mobilized this instrument, and it is used for a country at war and at war against a big power. So in a way, what was completely unimaginable a few years ago has become reality in a few hours. So there is the sense that this war in Ukraine is obviously first and foremost a tragedy and a big litmus test for all countries involved and for the EU in particular. But it is also indirectly a window of opportunity because it tends to align some perceptions in Europe and to make the call for strengthening military cooperation, defense cooperation, more legitimate and more credible. Second point that was interesting was that many countries at the same time declared that they wanted to increase their defense spending, in particular the case of Germany. I won't come back to this because it was well developed in the previous presentation. But it means, and this was in particular in the conclusions of the Versailles summit last week, that we have the opportunity to make these decisions more coordinated and to encourage member states to do this strengthening of their defense programs in a collaborative way. And here, I think there is, if you want me to talk a little bit about French expectations, there is a clear expectation that the EU goes further than what we have already. Not just what we declare in the strategic compass, not just what the Commission put on the table a few weeks ago in the defense package, but that we take further initiatives. The French president said it almost immediately after the start of the Russian invasion. He said the EU should be able to demonstrate that it is able to defend its own citizens, its own borders. So in a way, showing that the EU should do more. Obviously in complement with what NATO is clearly doing also to protect member states, but there is some rule to evolve also for the EU. There were some ideas that were put on the table by officially or informally by the French. One was that a new next generation EU for Ukraine or for defense should be launched. That was one of the first ideas that was discussed. There was no mention of that in the Versailles summit conclusions. I don't know exactly if this idea is completely abandoned or not. I know that some member states, in particular the Netherlands, immediately spoke against this idea, arguing that national budgets should be the first respondent to the crisis, and that there's no need at the moment to launch a new EU financial instrument to respond to this crisis. But, and that would be a more personal idea that I would like to put on the table, I think this is now the moment to think about the EU capacity as a financial actor. The EU has shown that it was able to put 1 billion euro on the table to support the Ukrainian military. And it is a bit ridiculous that the EU as an actor, or let's say the EU budget, is not able to support the military of its own member states. Of course, there are some legal provisions, in particular Article 41.2, that says that the EU budget cannot be used to support military operations or defense spendings. But I think that perhaps the time is good to have a debate on that, because it is possible to change those provisions without a big intergovernmental conference or a treaty amendment. There is an Article 42.2 that says that the European Council can decide to declare a common defense, and through that specific decision can create amendments or exceptions to existing rules. And I think that today we already have some financial instruments such as the European Defense Fund, but that go only until the level of military prototypes. But now we should go further, and it would be appropriate for the EU, and in particular for the EU budget, to be considered as an instrument to strengthen the acquisition capability of member states. And that would be my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Wonderful. Very interesting comments on this window of opportunity that is not only the case for military cooperation, but also for the energy transition in order to transition away from dependency on Russia. This interesting idea of the EU being built on crisis, which has been voiced elsewhere before, and then this renewed interest in market power Europe, or this idea of EU having this actorness and agency from its geoeconomic power. I wonder, though, if that will be enough to stop the war in Ukraine and prevent further atrocities being committed there. Perhaps we can now welcome Nikki to add her comments to the discussion. Thank you very much, Nikki, for joining us.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all the partners involved in organizing this event. I'm honored to contribute. It's obviously very timely and important what we're talking about today. What I'd like to do is discuss briefly the most likely prospects for EU foreign and security policy, and particularly some points we can look out for in the EU strategic compass. Now, Pierre has just now touched upon some important points already, so let me see where I can complement what he said just now, mainly in answering what can we expect as next steps. All right, so the war in Ukraine has been going on for about a month now, and it has been a month during which we have seen a number of tragic historical firsts. The first attacks on Kiev and other major Ukrainian cities since the Second World War, the highest level of nuclear tension since the Cold War, the fastest growing refugee crisis, with the UN reporting 10 million people have fled their homes in Ukraine since the war has begun. And at the same time, we're also seeing a number of historic firsts at the EU level in terms of its defense and foreign and security policy moves. Most prominently, we have seen the European Peace Facility, which has been touched upon earlier, through which the EU agreed in around 24 hours in the end to finance 500 million euros to purchase weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. I cannot stress enough how big this decision was, as the EU really broke its taboo of using its resources to supply, in this case, lethal weapons to a third country. Importantly, I think we're witnessing the forming of the political will for a more elaborate common European foreign and defense policy. As I said, so the EU is for the first time financing the purchase and delivery of weapons to a country at war. And we saw Germany make a big U-turn in reversing its historic policy by sending arms into conflict zones as well. At the same time, we're hearing discussions in Denmark about its foreign policy opt-outs. There's a national debate going on in Ireland on its neutrality. Finland and Sweden are reconsidering their NATO membership, and so on and so forth. So there are quite a few tectonic shifts going on at the moment. And as you may know, the EU is also approaching the end of the process in developing a strategic compass at the moment. The EU started working on that compass 2 years ago to guide the implementation of the EU global strategy, which was published in 2016. And the EU, in the words of Joseph Borrell at the time, wants to become a security provider for its citizens. All right, just a few things we can expect from the strategic compass. It will definitely provide a more granular threat assessment, but also very much a shared threat assessment. That means that the EU will diagnose its strategic environment, so to speak, the threats and challenges coming from it, but also it will include action points for the EU in this regard. And we'll see this time that this will also include action points in the realm of maritime security, outer space, cyber, and hybrid threats, and so on and so forth. So we can argue that there seems to be an increased recognition that strategic autonomy and being a security provider for the EU is more than just security and defense policy in a narrow sense of the word, but it's becoming much broader. But we will also learn how the EU 27 look at their threat horizon in terms of foreign and security policy. I'd like to raise 2 points in light of all this, and maybe to also pursue the question, so what can we expect next? I think the first point is that the strategic compass is coming out in the middle of a war, but it's definitely not written in response to that war. As I mentioned, this is a process that has been a very long time coming and has been concretely written on for the last 2 years. So it may seem an obvious point, but we have learned in some leaked versions of the document that the war in Ukraine has really prompted a significant rewrite, and Russia is taking center stage more and more. And there's definitely a shift in logic on the threat that Russia poses. But I think it remains important to keep for the EU to keep into account there are security threats and problems to the EU, not just from the East, but also from, for example, the South and in the rest of its neighborhood. So, and this is not just from the South, but also we see Russia projecting itself in these theaters in North Africa and the Middle East. And I think that sort of ancient dichotomy in EU foreign policy, East versus South, should definitely not prevent us from looking at European security policy holistically. And that will be something I'll look out for when the compass comes out. And then second, and I'll end on this, I think an important question at the moment is the durability of this renewed commitment to foreign and security policy. The EU really wants to become a major security actor, but in the end, we know that it will remain the member states who have the final say in this. I mean, as much as what we're currently seeing in Ukraine is unprecedented, historically, we have seen that crises do provide an impetus for change. And they sort of help us overcome difficult subjects in decision making, but also their fire wanes over time. And after the Crimea annexation, for example, we saw this great temporary commitment to increase defense spending and really upping the EU's capacity to act in foreign security policy. But we also saw that subside in subsequent years. And I think if you read what's going on, we do see some cracks in that united front of the EU over the prospect of deeper integration, particularly on the EU's response to the economic crisis that may be sparked by the war in Ukraine, with also a foreign minister of the Netherlands sort of speaking out over going too far in EU budget plans in that way. But we also see that in issues such as energy is really presenting some tough choices on European unity. And there, as we all know, there's a strong European dependence on Russian energy. So an important question for me, and perhaps for the discussion later on, will be, how will the commitment be sustained? What is going to be the impact of the upcoming recession on this unity? And well, those are things to look out for in the strategic compass, which will be adopted later this week, but also looking forward to discussing that later on during the questions.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Some very good points as well on this widening of security within the EU and how that impacts its foreign policy. That is very interesting. And then as well, I really like this comment that you made about, thinking of external actors' foreign policy, not just within the EU, but everywhere else in the world, eventually having an impact on the EU as a global actor and having therefore consequences for European citizens' social, economic conditions. So that is a very interesting discussion to have afterwards as well. I will now go on to our last speaker, Julian, who hopefully still will have some nice additions to make. Julian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sophie. Indeed, it's very hard to fill the gaps after the 3 excellent contributions and 3 excellent inputs of the previous speakers. But let me perhaps start with another strategic review that is currently in the pipe, that is the review of NATO strategic concept, that is due to be finished in June this year, the summit in Madrid. Well, obviously we can say for sure that the war in Ukraine has once again renewed the sense of purpose and the sense of mission for NATO. Again, this is an organization that we have to remember that the French President Macron just a few years ago called the brain dead, and it was increasingly drifting in terms of its focus. Americans were looking at Asia, but now it's purposeful, it's aligned, it's consolidated. It will get even more and more resources, and the future strategic concept therefore will likely clearly prioritize collective defense over the other 2 core objectives of NATO, that is crisis management and cooperative security. Last week, Secretary General Stoltenberg was speaking to reporters, and he said that the NATO will have to reset its military posture. according to the new reality. And this would include substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, with higher readiness, with more prepositioned equipment, not only on land, but also on the sea and in the air. And it's likely that the US and NATO will move beyond the current so-called tripwire forces that NATO have in the Baltic states. So this light battalion-sized battle groups in the Eastern Europe to instead deploy heavier, larger, and more permanent forces. So essentially, what NATO is saying that in light of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, in light of the war of aggression in Ukraine, the restrictions that has been put on NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe, according to the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, are irrelevant now. So what we might expect from the document of strategic of the new version of strategic concept is that finally NATO will have this kind of the unification of the eastern flank. This was one of the many complaints of the last years, that NATO has kind of prioritized after 2014 the Baltic, the northern part of the eastern flank over the southern part of the Black Sea. Now we can expect that there will be substantial NATO presence in all of the 8 member states of the eastern flank. So starting from the Estonia and down to the Bulgaria. So apart from that, indeed, when it comes to the EU, we'd also know that over the course of the history, the EU as a military actor grew out of different shocks and unexpected events, the Gulf War, the Kosovo, international terrorism. But each time this momentum that has been provided by those external shocks seemed to evaporate. Today, the EU experience is not just a shock, but it's an earthquake, right? So Putin has united Europeans, it has united EU member states, and in that sense, the threat analysis that was part of the strategic compass and was published in the very beginning of the review process need to be updated. Reportedly, there were concerns that member states were not on the same page when it came to viewing clearly articulating the Russian threats in the document. And now, as Nikki mentioned, the draft that has been published last year in November probably has already went through significant revisions when it comes to clearly positioning the threat that Moscow presents to Europe, not only in terms of military threats, but also the energy security and hybrid threats. So I would expect 3 things in the new document as a consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So one is something that the Eastern European member states were emphasizing for some time, that the EU has to be a security provider, not only in the south, but also in the eastern neighborhood. And again, exactly in this light, we have to see the decision to provide the little military aid to Ukraine through the European Peace Facility that Pierre and Nikki mentioned. But also, we might expect stronger language on the Article 42.7, so the mutual assistance clause, and that says that in the event of aggression against the EU member state, other members should come to their aid. Finland and Sweden would particularly be interested in having more strong language when it comes to this article. And also, we might expect to hear more of the rhetoric, more the language on strategic autonomy, not in its maximal understanding, so not in terms of decoupling from the US, but in its minimal sense. So developing, acquiring common capabilities, and especially those that are needed to defend itself collectively from Russia, such as joint air defense capabilities. When we zoom out and we look at the European security order, when we try to look beyond those 2 bureaucratic documents that are currently discussed, it's clear that we're now entering the post-Cold War environment. Again, the the war in Ukraine dispels the fog of peace that we experienced and witnessed in the last 30 years. This is the end of the peace dividend that we enjoyed in the last 30 years. And regardless how the war, regardless of the outcome of the war within Russia and Ukraine now, I think there are three trends and tendencies that would persist. First is that we will probably witness a build-up of US military power in Europe, not seen since the end of the Cold War. Again, ironically, just 2 years ago, we remember in 2020, Trump administration wanted to withdraw the many thousands of troops from Germany. Now, in just a couple of months, US military presence in Europe jumped from 80,000 to 100,000 troops. So that's the level of military presence the US had in 1997 when NATO began its expansion, and something that Putin says threatened Russia and must be reversed. We also likely see the new role of the new sense of the role of the United Kingdom in European security. For some time, experts and observers were speculating how this global Britain would look like, and once the UK published its integrated review, there were a lot of talk about the UK tilt to Asia. I think now this would be rather downplayed, and we see the UK is clearly doubling down on its help to Ukraine, and it seems that the global Britain brand is getting a new sense, a sense of purpose, especially after the chaotic exit from Afghanistan. And again, the UK was one of the countries that was very active in terms of rebuilding Ukrainian armed forces, even before the war, rebuilding Ukrainian Navy forces. And many of the Ukrainian experts currently pointed at the UK as one of the countries that might be providing bilateral security guarantees outside of NATO after the war. A few words on China. Well, China, yeah, I think clearly gaining from the war as of now. As a result of the war, Russia probably will likely be more weakened, and its dependence on China will grow. It is also in Beijing's interest that Russia doesn't lose this war. It needs Moscow as a junior partner, or maybe even buffer in its competition with the US. So I wouldn't exclude China's financial and economic support of Putin of some sort, even though rhetorically Beijing would probably continue to insist on being a neutral party. And it's likely that also in the future, this autocratic alliance this autocratic bromance between Russia and China that we observe today would embolden other autocrats around the world who are indifferent to international law and human rights, and would embolden them to act reckless in the region. Just, I think a week ago or 10 days ago, there were missile attacks of Iran in the northern part of Iraq, clearly targeting the US in the vicinity of the US embassy. And lastly, on the issue of refugees, again, we might discuss to what extent the EU membership perspective for membership offer to Ukraine is symbolic or not. But it's clearly that Ukrainians today are part of Europe, even though Ukraine might not be part of Europe yet, part of the EU. One of the reasons, of course, why Russia is currently trying to turn Ukrainian cities into rubble and firing indiscriminately into civilian buildings, and targeting schools and kindergarten, etc., of course, is the fact that they couldn't compete conventionally with Ukrainian armed forces. But another reason for that is also the lesson that Putin learned after the crisis in Syria, that migration can be weaponized. That the flow of migrants might destabilize the EU, destabilize European countries domestically. And again, we also witnessed this playbook last year on the border with Belarus, within Belarus and the EU. But on that account, once again, we Putin again miscalculated, and we saw how even though several months ago EU countries might not have had an agreement on how to redistribute and how to reform the immigration policy in the EU, but they opened the borders to the Ukrainians, allowing them to enter practically without any conditions. And some of the Ukrainian experts are currently joking that it's easier to cross the border with the EU for Ukrainians rather than to cross internal borders through multiple checkpoints now within the Ukraine itself. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Julian, for this very nice addition to what has already been said. I'm not sure if I really am convinced that China really benefited from this, because the communication line for their Belt and Road Initiative have really been affected. And I don't really know to what extent China would pair along with this huge reform of the international order that Russia is trying to do, but that China, I think from my perspective, was trying to benefit from, or to kind of like increase its influence on the current international order. But then you made some very, very interesting comments on the end of this post-Cold War order as we know it. And I wonder if we will see indeed, because of these sanctions and the way in which each power bloc is slowly isolating itself from the others, are we not on the beginning of a slippery slope there? And should we seek more of that autonomy, or should we actually seek more of that independence that, you know, some people say brings more peace? We already have some questions from the audience, so I will open the debate. Thank you so much once again for your wonderful overviews on the situation, which is a very complex situation, very difficult topic to speak about. So thank you for that again. We have a question from Hans van den Berg from the Young Diplomat. The first one is as follows. Obviously, we focus now on getting peace and security to the region as soon as possible. But what do we expect of the rebuilding and the peace building process? What will the influence of Russia be here? A very, very interesting question, which I will direct to Roderick Parks, if that's okay. So if we imagine that the war is over, if it is over, how can we rebuild, and what will be the role of great power in this peace building process?
Thanks, Sophie. Am I allowed to pick up 2 points that have been made before? Sure. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
The first was on the strategic compass and what changes we expect. I just skimmed through the draft from 5th of March. I think, Julian, you said there was going to be a lot on Article 42.7. I can't see much, funny enough. I can see a lot more on Article 44 about the EU sort of making it easier to send off operations. 42.7, the sort of mutual defence clause, is all, as I can see it, under preparing together. So we go through joint exercises to work out when the mutual defence clause should be triggered. As I remember, and Pierre, you'll have to correct me here, I seem to remember that's what the French wanted in the first place. They wanted some joint exercises a couple of years ago, thinking about scenarios where 42.7 might be triggered, and the Germans said, no, you need a strategic compass. So I think the French have said, thanks for this useless exercise, now let's get back to where we were. And I think the most concrete thing that I can see in the current draft is still this sort of rapid intervention force. And as for the UK, it's listed in 4th place after the US, Norway, and Canada in terms of important strategic partners, coming in just ahead of Japan. So I would say there's a bit of a French influence there. And the second thing was, I think, Nikki, you said we should take into account much more, or sort of overcome the East-South divide in foreign policy thinking. I was sitting in a conversation yesterday with sort of European policy planners, and all of them agreed if we rethink Europe's security architecture, then we need to get out of the habit of thinking in east-west terms and think much more in sort of north-south terms as well. And everybody sort of agreed on that, I think. Apart from maybe the American, I'm not sure he kept his head down. So that I think is on the agenda. Anyway, sorry. In terms of what the EU can do with peace building, I mean, again, I just come out of another discussion, but with Brussels people, and they say use the 300 billion euros worth of assets we've frozen from central bank, get Russia out of Ukraine, and direct all of that into rebuilding the country, which is a lovely idea, but it is then presaged on a neat end to this conflict and Russia withdrawing. And I think the reality is going to be rather more messy and protracted than that. So what can we do? It may be the regulatory side of things, and I'll maybe come back to that in a second. In all the conversations that we've been having with the Ukrainians and the Moldovans and a little bit Georgians, they're very keen to get a European presence in the country so that we have skin in the game. And they think it'll be easier for us. You know, my old colleague Nicu Popescu, who's the foreign minister in Moldova, wants a Frontex mission. Of course he does. You know, that gets us involved. Humanitarian workers as well. We're just not used to the politicization of agencies and humanitarian workers, so I think it'd be tricky. Final thought, sorry, regulatory power. I'm a real skeptical about this. At the moment, it's a mix of, well, the idea of the Brussels effect, that we leverage the internal market to spread our rules abroad, as far as I'm concerned, is a mix of French protectionism and German overregulation. Sorry, Pierre. But you know, we put up barriers around the internal market. Germany deepens the rules, and then we say to foreigners who want access to the internal market under our conditions. And I think conflicts in the neighbourhood increase that tendency to put up barriers, but they also alienate our neighbours and turn interdependence and connectivity into something that we're afraid of. If China came up, if we're thinking about interdependence, then my colleagues say let's not think of sort of autarky and building up sort of European industrial policy to be self-sufficient. We should be investing in indispensable technologies that the Chinese cannot do without to force them to cooperate with us on our terms. But let's not think of sort of autarky. It needs to be on new principles such as indispensability. Sorry, that was a bit of a mishmash. Anyway, there we are. That's my response.
Thank you so much. Nikki, would you like to come in?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, good question regarding peace building and the rebuilding process. I'm assuming this is mostly focused on Ukraine. I think an important point to make is that this will depend in a large part on the institutional relationship that the EU is going to have with Ukraine, and in really fleshing this out. And I know that over the past week we have heard a few times, especially Ursula von der Leyen mentioning the possibility of a fast track for Ukraine EU membership. I am a little bit skeptical of at least of the fast track, and especially given the great number of chapters which will have to be worked through at breakneck speed in Ukraine to achieve that. But I think, yes, the rebuilding, and especially seeing the next steps ahead in sort of institutional rebuilding of Ukraine, that is going to depend on its relationship with the EU. And again, as we all see now, Russia is a crucial factor in that relationship. As you know, the last crisis and the Crimea annexation in 2014 were sparked by Ukraine signing association agreement and a free trade agreement with the EU. So yeah, just to flag that, yes, the influence of Russia will definitely depend also on the type of relationship the EU wants to pursue with Ukraine to achieve that sort of rebuilding after the war. Just a quick note on the second point, which I'll also defer to my colleagues, but I am quite curious, just to bounce it back, what influence building would be for the EU. But if I were to think of how the EU could leverage its regulatory power, I understand Roderick's skepticism, but also the war again has shown that if not its regulatory appeal, there's a massive appeal to the EU still, and the EU is becoming an even bigger sort of driver of democracy regionally and abroad. And I think we cannot underestimate that going forward, and its continued appeal despite all of what's happening.
Great, thank you. I will jump on that question as well, which I will redirect to Pierre. This question from Hans van der Beek as well, which was, again, in the long run, how can the EU utilize its regulatory power in favor of security and influence building? Since you mentioned that earlier, perhaps you could explain into more details how that works in practice.
Okay, so far the geoeconomic strategy that the EU has been pursued is rather defensive. It's really look at vulnerabilities, areas of critical dependence vis-a-vis external powers. As I said during the COVID crisis, the case in point was really the relationship with China in particular, and trying to reduce this vulnerability. It was already important from an institutional and bureaucratic point of view, because it meant that the EU would not look at a particular issue just through the angle of an economic interest, increasing trade and so on, but through the security dimension. So typical examples are regulations on foreign and direct investments, initiatives on the impact of foreign subsidies on EU security, and more recently the reflection on the anti-coercion instrument, partially as a response to Chinese sanctions on Lithuania after it left the Chinese-led group of 17 plus 1. So there was this idea that the EU can protect its member states against vulnerabilities on external powers. There is also the idea that the EU can use its economic leverage more strategically, perhaps by coordinating its foreign aid policy a little bit more with its foreign policy objectives, try to behave not just as a global governance agency, but as a union trying to defend the specific interests, and in particular security interests of its member states. So that's the general overview. In terms of the evolution of the situation in the relationship between Ukraine, Russia, and the EU, I would connect this question to something you mentioned earlier, the potential for deglobalization here. Because sanctions, the political the objective of sanctions is to have a political influence over the targeted country. But there is always a risk that eventually the sanctions become permanent and that everybody adapt to the new situation. And then the sanction is no longer a sanction, it's just the new normal. It's a bit like a smoker. If you would take away the cigarettes, the first day it hurts and you can perhaps influence the smoker, but after 1 year, 2 years, it's just a new way of life. And in the case of Russia and the EU, there is the risk that eventually the EU tried to disengage, to decouple from Russia. Russia tries to find alternative markets and to reduce its own trade dependence vis-a-vis the European market. Everybody finds alternative to reliance on the other, and at the end, there's no sanction anymore. There's just two closed blocks in terms of financial instruments, trade, technologies, and so on. Of course, it is a bit of a caricature, but it's just to show that there is the risk that eventually we don't have any impact. We just create a new status quo that is not necessarily the one we actually want.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. Julian, did you want to add something on these questions? Otherwise, I have another one coming up.
Just perhaps very quickly. Well, my view is that it's actually might be a bit premature to talk about peace building and rebuilding if there are still existential threat to the Ukraine itself. We might be. It's a bit, of course, tempting to take this this operational pause in the military activities in Ukraine as a sort of stalemate. But again, Russian Federation has currently regrouping its forces to continue the assault. So we might not even we don't know whether Ukraine as a state would survive, whether we have one Ukraine or two Ukraine. So I would first and foremost, think about ways and measures for the EU and for the West to help Ukrainian state survive and push back against the conventional military threats that it's currently fighting.
Very good point. Thank you so much. I will go ahead and ask one of the questions that was written in the Q&A regarding Cyprus. So this person is asking regarding a possible European defense alliance. If Turkey ever attacks Cyprus, do you think that an EU military alliance would come to the aid of Cyprus? Who would like to answer that question? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I think from a legal point of view, this is an interesting case because obviously, since Turkey is a NATO member, that wouldn't be possible under Article 5. So this is among the scenarios that are sometimes discussed for the implementation of Article 42.7. Politically, this is another story, and of course, it will depend on the context. For instance, the tension between Turkey and Greece was very high some times ago, and now it's a bit different because of the context of the war in Ukraine, and perhaps they try to put it on the side or to maintain a workable relationship because there is this huge crisis at the doors. So, of course, the political question is unpredictable. You have to look at the context. That would be my answer. But theoretically and from a legal point of view, this is an interesting case because obviously when we talk about Article 42.7, we want to find cases that are not just overlapping with the implementation of Article 5, but complementary to it.
Yes, and it's interesting to see how the war in Ukraine has, or perhaps our inability to foresee the war in Ukraine happening has prompted us to think as well about other complicated situations. Cyprus, but also Taiwan and China is high on the agenda. I will shift now to another question that we have in the chat from Olaf Berberish. I hope I'm pronouncing that not too bad. The question is, a majority in Russia believes that Ukraine is being persecuted by Nazis. Would Russia see it as a warlike interference in its sovereignty to provide Russian citizens with digital access to objective information? Who would like to answer that question? So this idea of providing Russian citizens with a different side of the stories and trying to counteract the propaganda efforts being led by the Kremlin. Roderick, did I see your hand?
No, it's a good trick though, and I'll do my best. I don't know. I mean, my colleague Tyson Barker put out an analysis of this a couple of days ago, making the case for precisely that. And the BBC has started sort of broadcasting on shortwave radio. I mean, it's not digital access, but it still provides some kind of access. There hasn't been any pushback on that as far as I'm aware. I mean, I guess picking up on what Pierre said, there's a question that. So another analysis we put out is looking at Russia's attempt to achieve sort of digital sovereignty, and this comes back to what Pierre was saying about what are we driving different sort of spheres in the technological domain, information spheres, and so on. If we start behaving in this way, do we drive that kind of bifurcation or not? More interesting to me, I guess, is the kind of third information sphere. So not in the West and not in Russia, but in the global South. This comes back to something you were saying, Sophie. And I wouldn't want to lose sight of that, because I think we can do much more in that sphere than we can in Russia. And we were looking at some sort of polling evidence from Africa and Asia. And as I hinted at what I said before, the EU is not looked at in this conflict as an upholder of rules-based order and stability. It's looked at as creating instability, and it ties into the narrative about Western behavior in Libya and elsewhere. With Africa already facing drought, European actions and sanctions are looked at as completely irresponsible. So, to me, it's almost more important what's happening in that information sphere, because I think we might already have lost that battle. Sorry, again, a bit of a mishmash of answer, but you keep picking on me first.
Thank you. It's my fault. Would anyone like to add anything on that?
Yeah, just a more practical point. I'm not sure to what extent the EU can provide digital access to neutral information, just in technical terms. Now, that's definitely not my specialty, but the EU has been, over the past years, pursuing more the course of strategic communication, combating disinformation especially in Eastern Europe, and it has been pouring more money and more efforts into this. Admittedly, the efforts did start out somewhat limited in 2015, but we are seeing an increased commitment, and there's no doubt that what's currently going on will increase the efforts in that respect. So it's not necessarily geared at Russian citizens. At this point, it's really aimed at Eastern Europe. But yes, that might also have to do with the fact that just reaching Russian citizens at this moment might be very complicated for the EU.
Precisely, indeed. There's been a lot of content being published right now, even in Russian language. But exactly, if it cannot reach the Russian citizens because of this war of sanctions over one information network and the other, and we ban RT and we ban Facebook, and then we are creating just huge echo chambers where one side never really listens to the other. And of course, right now we see the problem mainly on the side of Russian citizens not being able to access facts about the war that is being waged in Ukraine, but it's also problematic the other way around, and creates this very conflicting view of us versus them. So yes, I agree that this is a very complicated dilemma that we are seeing here.
Sophie, can I maybe just come in and say, because Nikki said she didn't know what was possible, I can only repeat what my clever colleagues say. And I can see that Olaf has talked about encrypted VPN access. We said should fund encrypted digital communication tools and virtual private networks that can avoid detection and provide links to the outside world. In Russia's increasingly autarkic internet RUNET, they should also develop very small aperture terminals, VSAT, and low Earth orbit satellite capabilities to provide coverage and connectivity to the global internet. And Elon Musk has apparently answered the call by Ukrainian officials to open Starlink satellite internet services. So, I mean, I can barely turn on a computer, but apparently there are some technical things that can be done.
Very good. Thank you for this addition. Would anyone like to add anything on this question?
Well, just very quickly, Ukrainian authorities are quite also effective in terms of opening the hotlines for the relatives and of Russian soldiers that might have they might be lost, right, in Ukraine and on the trainings of providing information to them what is happening. But in general, well, if the question was whether providing objective information will be the act of war, or will we perceive the act of war, we have to remember that in terms of Russian military doctrine, Russia has been already at war on multiple fronts and for many years with the West, and Putin himself mentioned that sanctions are also introduction of the sanctions by the West also is an act of war. So if something has to be vilified or the Kremlin Russian authorities can easily play the narrative of anything being an existential threat to even objective information and independent news.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that touches upon what was mentioned earlier, I think by Nikki, about this ever-expanding notion of security and where does it stop, and what is then a legitimate reason to provide some action. I wonder if we have any more questions from the audience, which we still have a good group online, but I think everyone is a bit shy to ask questions. Or perhaps we have any more additional comments from the panel.
Yeah, if there's no question, I can also, I would like to emphasize on a few points that were already made. I think, in particular, Nikki, on the idea that this is not a world war, but this is definitely a global competition, and I think this is true, as was said also earlier by Roderick, of the information war, and we tend to look at the information strategies in Europe or in Russia, but obviously, I think that the big game for Russia is the rest of the world and how they're perceived in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on. And with French perspective, for instance, the fact that RFI and France 24, so a French TV station and a French radio station were also banned in Mali just after the European Union banned RT and Sputnik. We know that Mali is partially under the influence of the Russian-led Wagner company. So, and perceptions in Africa are very different because they don't necessarily feel close to Ukrainians the same as members of the European Union do. And they can also see this conflict as an opportunity to criticize the role of Western countries in Africa, so through a very different angle. And obviously, there is a global dimension here, and we cannot just focus on what's going on in our close neighborhood in terms of diplomatic leverage or information power.
That's very true, and it's hard to ignore as well. It's hard to ignore as well the past mistakes of the West that have been done in similar situations in the past, whether that's the EU or NATO or the US or specific EU member states. It's hard to ignore as well the difference in the response to the refugee income that has touched Europe. I mean, it's a completely different experience, and I do empathize with people of color and people from other countries which have experienced a refugee crisis completely differently based on their color. And I also am being made aware of many different instances of people of color who are from Ukraine who are being treated completely differently at the borders when trying to escape the war. So this is also a question that is very, very relevant to ask. Thank you. So unless there are any more questions from the audience or comments to be, yes, Julian, you want to come in? Go ahead.
Well, just to add about the global ramification, what Pierre mentioned, I think that what was very interesting is when during the debate, the very first debate in the UN Security Council, the Kenyan representative made a very powerful speech, and actually he mentioned that, well, the war is close to our heart if we look at it from the neo-colonial perspective. So from that point of view, as Russia, former metropole, attacking former colony Ukraine and trying to redraw its borders, and this is something that that resonates very well with some of the African countries. But one question that I wanted to mention is particularly interesting to me. Turkey was raised, and Turkey is one of those actors in the war that still keeps trying to sit on the fence, right? This has been the Turkish position for many years, since 2014, since occupation of Crimea. So we do develop close defense ties with the Ukrainians. We do sell them Bayraktar drones. We develop different defense projects, but we also try to keep a good relationship with Russia. And my expectation was that actually after the war, Erdogan and Ankara would be forced to choose the sides, would be forced to make a clear choice. And so far, this has not been happening. Right now, US clearly pressuring or ramping up some pressure on Turkey, and in particular, we know there's enough debate on how Ukrainian air defense systems can be strengthened with jets or with some other equipment. And currently, US is pushing Turkey actually to give to Ukraine the S-400 that has been bought from Russia in a sort of in a measure of solidarity and support that Ukraine actually needs right now at this point, not in 5 or 10 years, but right now today. And it would be very interesting how those countries like Turkey, Israel, that trying to present themselves as mediators, how their position would evolve as the war drags on.
Very good. Thank you for these last comments. Very important points as well. Now I will try and close this very interesting discussion, very timely and very interesting, with some key points that progressively took shape all over my notes while I was listening to your very interesting statements. The first point is this apparent unity and effectiveness through the sanctions of Europe and of EU member states. This unity is contrasted, however, with apparent division on the issue of membership and of further integration that is arising from the war. Second, this unity is contrasting with the incapacity of actually stopping the war so far and the atrocities that keep happening day to day. This unity is also contrasted with this seemingly increasing isolation of each power block in the world. And the unity is also contrasted with the rather defensive position that was mentioned of the EU rather than a proactive strategic impact on global affairs. And I would like to add to that as well, this question, solidarity was mentioned. How long will this solidarity actually last? And I have in mind particularly concerns for the refugees that are entering Ukraine now. We mentioned before, and Dirk mentioned at the start of the discussion, this interesting questions of short-term and long-term. And so we have to make sure that one goes with the other. The second theme that arises from this discussion is in this global competition for influence, whether that is influence through information, financial systems, or energy, this global competition is really taking shape, and the war in Ukraine is really just one example of that. And we have seen the EU growing as an actor, as was mentioned by Pierre, through financial and economic tools, but also through a renewed interest in military cooperation. We have never seen NATO being more relevant than right now. This window of opportunity as well that was mentioned for more integration, for a more rapid energy transition that is bringing a little bit of hope to this situation, which also was mentioned before, this capacity of the EU to bounce back from its crisis and its biggest challenges. And then I would like to finish with the third point that arises from this discussion, which is the constant moral dilemmas that the EU as an actor is going through, and that is preventing it from really being an effective and proactive actor in itself through security crisis. And so I wonder, in face of these moral dilemmas and divisions and seeming unity, but then global competition, can the EU really become the security provider that it has promised to be? Perhaps this is a question we should ask in another edition. And actually the next edition of the European Strategic Dialogue will be on 23rd of May. So do mark your agendas. I will then finish this excellent discussion by thanking our speakers once again for your valuable contributions, patience, and availability in this very different and complicated time to be alive. So thank you once again to all of our speakers. Thank you to our audience for participating. And I wish everyone a very nice end of the week. We have sun here in The Hague. I hope that you have sun wherever you are. Thank you so much. Bye.